When remembering WCW, it's easy and kind of fun to focus on the bad. WCW had the world in the palm of its hand, but through some bad decisions and even worse booking, ended up being reamed by Vince and his baby oil bruisers. However, you know what? At their peak, they weren't just a poor alternative, they were the counter-culture offering that nearly brought the WWE to its knees. So today, instead of pointing out the mistakes, let's celebrate the big gold belt and all who grappled underneath it. With this in mind, I'm Jules for WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 best decisions that WCW ever made. Number 10. Taking a chance on Randy Savage. While nobody really questioned WCW's signing of Hulk Hogan, given that he was the biggest name that professional wrestling had ever produced, Randy Savage was a slightly different story. Though a big name in his own right, Savage had also spent the last few years of his WWE career largely as a commentator, and when he did lace up, he looked to have more ring rust than Brie Bella. Actually, that's not fair, because Randy can actually wrestle. But in WCW, Randy found a new life. Shrugging off his on-again, off-again, will they, won't they with Hulk Hogan, his series against Diamond Dallas Page in 1997 was a particular career highlight for a man with no shortage of them. Randy Savage proved to be a steady hand whenever WCW needed it the most, and at times he showed that he could still draw fans in a way that WWE thought was well past him. Number 9. Not being afraid to push outside talent. In classic WCW style, this one is a bit of a mix of the good and a bit of the bad. While WCW's insistence on favouring established talent over their own homegrown stars would be one of many nails in their coffin, it's hard to argue against the company's idea to treat outside wrestling talent as valid contenders within the organisation right away. Just because you made your name somewhere else doesn't mean that WCW was going to repackage you or resent you for it. This mindset was a drastic change of pace from the WWE mentality at the time that essentially stated, if it didn't happen here, it didn't happen anywhere. No, not like that. In fact, it's actually taken years for the WWE to drop this attitude, and here, WCW was doing it decades earlier. Number 8. Giving performance-based bonuses. In quite a shocking instance, WCW was one of the first and only companies to ever really give a tangible reward for popping both the boys and the crowds. When Kip Allen Frey stepped into WCW as Executive Vice President in 1992, one of the first things that he did was implement a weekly bonus to performers who really went out of their way to put on spectacular matches. At a time when WCW wrestlers were being stiffed out of every dime the company could save, such generosity not only increased the quality of matches, but the locker room mood as well. Rewarding workers who do their jobs better than anyone else. What a concept. Number 7. Letting wrestlers be themselves. At a time when wrestlers were still required to work under the weight of increasingly over-the-top gimmicks, WCW took a rather novel approach by just allowing their performers to be themselves. It's kind of like the same approach we have here at WhatCulture, except we all ended up being smug. Obviously, there is the exception, the lovely man butter that is Simon Millen. God, I would. There is no better example of this than Chris Jericho, who ditched the babyface persona the company originally saddled him with and instead began to cut a series of famous promos and vignettes that helped establish the rock star heel character that would turn him into a wrestling legend. Number 6. Turning Bill Goldberg into an unbeatable monster babyface. WCW wasn't exactly known for their willingness to push young talent to the top of their card over veteran wrestlers, but in the case of Bill Goldberg, they hit upon an absolute berg. The monster babyface is a concept that few companies ever really ran with before, but at a time when the NWO was running the show, Goldberg's unstoppable streak of dominance proved to be an idea the fans couldn't get enough of. Goldberg rarely spoke, never lost, and created a bloodlust amongst the WCW faithful that the company was smart enough to draw out over a long period as he worked higher and higher up the food chain. Even if you weren't a WCW devotee at the time, it was almost impossible not to tune in during Bill Goldberg's undefeated streak. Number 5. Pushing Diamond Dallas Page late in his career. It's easy to forget that Diamond Dallas Page spent the majority of his career as a mediocre wrestler and manager. In fact, he only really had a few good years as an all-round performer at the top, but what a few years they were. DDP may have already been 40 years old when WCW decided to start pushing him in 1996, but the company recognized the work that Page had done in a very short time to turn his career around. In short order, Page turned into a performer that simply captivated crowds with his iconic finisher and mannerisms. More importantly though, Page helped bring out the best of all the others that he worked with. See, the man's been helping people way before DDP Yoga was ever on the cards. Number 4. Drawing out the Sting-Hogan feud. Right, so if you are being a sneaky little todger, then you could argue that the Sting-Hogan rivalry began the very moment that Hulk Hogan walked into the company as the top babyface. But their first actual on-screen feud started the moment Hulk Hogan turned heel in July of 1996 and ran all the way to December of 1997. It was a rivalry that stretched over a year and a half of weekly television time. Rarely has that kind of patience and long-term planning ever been implemented outside of me trying to bed one of your mothers. I kid, she's easier to get into the sack than those kittens I drown. There's my weird one-per list. WCW could have pulled the trigger at any point for a huge payday, but they simmered the soup for as long as possible. I mean, the match itself was an eventual disaster, but let's not ignore how brilliant the journey was. Number 3. Going head-to-head with Monday Night Raw. When it came to dealing with the competition, WCW could have easily made a mint by simply putting on shows when the WWE was off the air, but that wasn't the direction that Bischoff wanted to take the company. He didn't want to hide from the WWE, but instead present itself to fans as a direct challenger. While many no doubt questioned his decision to go against Raw head-on, Bischoff devoted all of his creative efforts and energy to making Monday Night Nitro stand out from Raw every single week. From surprise appearances to pay-per-view worthy matches, he knew that the hearts and minds of wrestling fans were going to be won on weekly television ratings. It was a huge risk, but it ultimately gave us the Monday Night Wars, and therefore the most lucrative period in wrestling history. Number 2. Giving the cruiserweights a home. At a time when WCW was trying to be as different as possible, they found that the biggest thing missing from the WWE product was something they'd been actively ignoring for years. Vince had been approaching things with a bigger is better attitude, but that meant for a lot of the air quotes little guys that they didn't have a voice. So that's exactly who WCW began to take interest in. Guys like Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Ultimo Dragon. These guys were outstanding in their field, and the newly dubbed Cruiserweight division was given large chunks of TV and pay-per-view time. Although not all would reach the heights they should have within the company, it's a damn sight better than what the WWE is doing with the division right now. And number 1, turning Hulk Hogan heel. I mean, really, what else could it have been? In retrospect, turning Hulk Hogan heel at the Bash at the Beach 1996 was the perfect move at the perfect time. It's easy to forget, though, that it was also just about the riskiest thing WCW could have ever done. Turning the icon of their business and the industry into a bad guy at a time when bad guys weren't considered to draw much money could have backfired on the company. Instead, they got the NWO. Years of television ratings dominance, millions of dollars, and arguably the most iconic moment in wrestling history. Whatever else WCW may have done or gone on to do, it's impossible to deny that in this one glorious moment that they made one of the absolute best decisions that any professional wrestling company has ever made.